Good evening, everyone. Hello, from wherever you are in time and space. My name is Nicole Wallack, and I want to welcome you to our event tonight. This is Writing Inside and Outside the Academy and Writing Stories of Science Inside and Outside of the Academy with Professor Brian Greene as our special guest. This is the last of our series, and I couldn't be more delighted that we get to conclude this event with Brian tonight. Before we get started, I just want to tell you a couple of points about how the event will go to help you know how best you might be able to participate in it yourselves, and then we'll get right into our conversation. So first thing that you should know is that this event is being recorded and will live on YouTube as long as, I don't know, YouTube lets us do those things. And that means that we will ask that if you want to make a comment in the Q&A part of this conversation, that you're welcome to have your camera on in order to do that, so that we can hear your own voice and see you as you ask that question. We also find that because Zoom is so strange as a medium, it's getting less strange, but we're still getting used to it, that if you had the ability and desire to keep your camera on throughout tonight's event, it also just makes us know that you're there, and that's quite wonderful. So we'd be happy to see you. And I can now see folks turning their cameras on. Hi, Alessia. Nice to see you. And we'll be glad to see you as the night goes on. Let me just tell you now about Q&A. If you have a question that you'd like to pose to Professor Greene, if you would do so by writing your question to our wonderful collaborator, Dean Beth Samea from the School of Professional Studies. Without Beth, none of this series could have happened in the first place. So thank you so much, Beth, for everything. Today, she's working under the name Beth Samea Q&A. And so if you direct her questions there, and then we can see them here. So this year marks the 13th since we have in the undergraduate writing program, which is part of the Department of English and Comparative Literature here in Columbia, hosted events with our colleagues, writers, academics, who work both inside and outside the academy to bring ideas and to exchange understanding. And we felt it was really important to have this series this year, given the difficulties of anyone getting any of their writing done, and also to remember that even when you're writing on your own, you're still writing in a community, a large community of writers. And so the work of tonight will focus a great deal on what it means to actually do the writing that we do. And I think it's really important and quite wonderful when the folks who are working at the top of their professions and who are doing the work that's groundbreaking in their fields can share with us both the content and the practice of that. And so I am so glad that we'll have a chance to talk about that with Brian Greene, who I'll introduce now. Brian Greene probably needs no introduction, but who knows? Maybe a few of you need it. So Brian Greene is professor of physics and mathematics at Columbia University and director of Columbia's Center for Theoretical Physics. He is recognized for a number of groundbreaking discoveries in mathematical physics and superstring theory. Professor Greene's books, The Elegant Universe, The Fabric of the Cosmos, The Hidden Reality, and Until the End of Time, his most recent book, have collectively spent 67 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and sold over 2 million copies worldwide. Professor Greene is a frequent guest on late night TV and was the host of 2 award-winning Nova miniseries based on his books. He also wrote and performed in Light Falls, which we'll talk a little bit about later, and a live theatrical exploration of Einstein's discoveries, which was broadcast nationally on PBS. Together with Tracy Day, Professor Greene co-founded the World Science Festival and serves as the chairman of the board. And with that, I'd like to welcome so much Professor Brian Greene.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Great. So one of the things that I just wanted us to get started with is to think a little bit about your own history as a writer. And you've written so many books and you've written so many co-authored papers and all kinds of things. It's a wonder that you can do anything else. So will you tell us a little bit about, I know you went to Stuyvesant. I want to know if you had Frank McCourt as a teacher. I
didn't, unfortunately.
Okay.
But it was the same era. It was definitely the same era.
It was the same era because my sister was at Stuyvesant at the same time. Anyway, so, but I was wondering about where you started writing and what kinds of things you started writing.
Well, I'm certainly an unlikely writer based on the things that captivated my attention early on and the approach that I took to them. I certainly remember, for instance, when I was in college, and textbooks were assigned for a physics course, I would go to the bookstore, and if the textbook had a lot of words, my heart sank. The textbook was only equations. I was breathing a sigh of relief. You know, that was sort of the orientation that I had for a long time in terms of the way I sort of engaged with the world. So writing for me actually did not begin with writing. It really began with speaking. And actually, I give a little vignette of this in the latest book, but for a different reason. I speak about an 11th grade class that I took at Stuyvesant High School that had the unlikely name Hygiene. I don't think they teach it any longer. It was a course, I'm slightly misnamed. It was a little bit about hygiene. I guess I should look up hygiene and all the variations of the definition. But it was about first aid. It was about well-being and things in that domain. It was taught by the coaches and the gym teachers, and they did not have enough material to fill out the full semester. So halfway through, they would ask the students, they would give a project to the students that they had to teach a class on something that was tangentially or directly related to the theme of hygiene or the body or something of that sort. And so most of those student taught lectures were pretty boring, I have to say. You know, people just go up and they sort of drone on. And I was like determined to do something that would have more life to it, that would have more energy and interest to it. So I focused upon dreaming, which I'd always been fascinated by. And I gave this lecture on dreaming. And it was the first time that I'd been in front of an audience where I really felt that I had them, that they were with me, that they weren't waiting for the bell to ring in order for the period to be over. And so it was really through that experience that I had an interest in public speaking. And I was given an opportunity at the Aspen Ideas or the Aspen Institute for Physics, I forget which institution it was, back in 1997 or so, to give a public lecture on physics. I'd never given one before. And I gave this public lecture, and afterwards a number of people said, hey, you know, is there a book I can read where I can go further? And I realized that there wasn't. So I began to think about writing a book. And when I sat down to write the book, I really wrote as if I was speaking. So that's really the trajectory that I followed.
And so that book was The Elegant Universe?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
And so how long did that book take you to write?
Well, I had a draft in about a year, and it was awful. It was really bad, man. And
how bad was it?
The reason why it was bad is, I'll tell you why. It was for a very specific reason. It was bad because I was reluctant to, I was going to be speaking about some of the work that I had done, research that I had accomplished. And I was really concerned that the book would look like it was a vehicle for me trying to say how important I was to the field. Mm-hmm. So to avoid that, I left my name out of all of that work, and I left everybody else's name out of all of their work in order that there wouldn't be any issue of why did you mention that person? Why did you mention yourself? Why didn't you mention me? That kind of thing. And because of that, the book was really dry. There was no human story. There's no human element that was intertwined with the scientific ideas. And after reading that draft, I said, this is not going to work. I've got to put it. So I put everybody back in that was relevant. I put myself in, and I put everybody else who was relevant to any ideas. And it came to life because I was injecting life into the narrative. And that's really what the difference between the final version and the version I had after that first year. So that revision took about a year. So I'd say all in, it was about 2 years.
It was 2 years. That still sounds remarkably fast for many of us.
Here's the other thing too that I should mention. When it came to writing The Elegant Universe, I could just sit down and write it. I didn't need to research anything. I didn't need to look anything up. There was zero back-end research. No index cards, not that I use them anyway, but there was nothing like that. I could just sit down and write it because it was talking about things that either I had been thinking about for decades or that were right at the cutting edge and there wasn't anything to read. So it was just a matter of being the conduit from the insights that were taking place at the frontier of research, translating that into a language that would be widely accessible, or at least that's the hope, that it would be widely accessible. So that's why it was a very streamlined process.
And as you worked your way through that revision, I can hear that one of the issues was making it sound like a person was writing it and that there were people involved in the story, right, that you were trying to tell in it. Were there other things that you had to, that were sort of hard won for you in writing that, in that first book, that either you have continued to have to work on as a writer, or in fact, like, I had to learn it that one time and I have been able to do it since?
Well, I think there were certainly hurdles that I was intimidated by when I was writing the book. And most of those hurdles were scientific ideas that I wanted to capture with integrity, and yet was uncertain if they would be intelligible to somebody who didn't have any background in the subject. And the one that really was the most terrifying for me was quantum mechanics. And in The Elegant Universe, I'm quite certain, although maybe I'm wrong after all these years, I'm pretty sure it's chapter 4, because chapter 4 was always in the back of my mind. As I was writing the rest of the chapters, I was like, what about chapter 4? And even in subsequent chapters, I would make reference in a chapter back to what I was going to say in chapter 4. There was a lot of burden in chapter 4 on quantum mechanics. And finally the day came and I had to write chapter 4 on quantum mechanics. And it was definitely a bit of a terrifying undertaking to begin. And what I found, which really informs all of the writing that I do, is that if you can find the right anecdote, the right scenario, the right even silly episode that you can inject the ideas and use that as a vehicle, you can get across just about any idea. And the little silly vehicle in that case, I made up some little story about people trapped in a basement with a frugal landlord that wouldn't allow them to turn up the heat. And the way they turned up the heat and how they paid for it turned out to be directly reflective of a core element of quantum physics. And so with this little story that anybody could grasp, the key idea was there. And once the key idea was there, then it was smooth sailing to then flesh it out into a chapter that would explain what quantum mechanics was about. So
is the hardest thing to learn to do to be silly?
Well, I have to say, at times being silly is a powerful device, because when material is so abstract and so taxing to the human mind to really understand, having an element of levity, perhaps that's even a better word to use, is important, is a vital way in which the reader can catch their breath and get on with the journey. So the willingness to do that, I think, is important. I have certainly found, as I've gotten older, my willingness to be silly has gone down. I think as a young, I was in my mid-30s when I wrote The Elegant Universe, and it was meant to be a playful approach to pretty heady ideas. And some of it, when I look at now, I look at it like, I wouldn't do that now. And I think that's a natural process of change. I'm not even saying it's a process of maturation. It's really a process of change.
So when you're thinking, say, in your most recent work, there's still a strong storytelling thread, right? In every chapter, really. Um, how does your mind work when you're working on a book like that? Meaning, I've heard stories about your ability to sit and write and really get immersed in the work. But how is it that you construct a chapter, for example?
Well, I don't plan. I mean, there are many people who plan things out, and somehow all I do is have a very, very high level skeletal vision of where I want to get and the kinds of things that I want to discuss. But I don't find that I can plan out, because for me, the act of figuring what the chapter is going to cover happens in the act of writing the chapter. And sometimes that means a chapter will go on too long and I'll need to divide it in half at some point. That's not an infrequent exercise that I find myself undertaking. And so what I do for real nuts and bolts perspective is,
I love that.
I try to write 3 pages ish a day. And the very next day, what I do is what I always tell myself not to do, but I always do it without fail, is I'll spend half a day revising those 3 chapters. And then I'll try to press through. And if I'm lucky, I can get 3 more, but maybe I'll only get 2 more. And then the next day, I don't go back to those 2. I go back to the beginning and I do it again. And so I revise every page every day. And that continues until the publisher says to me, we're going to have to start charging you because we're in the blue pages now. And it's really time to stop. And then I'll say, okay. And then I'll turn up at their doorstep and say, I really need to make a few more changes. And they'll look, and now they're used to it. So they plan for it. But in the early days, that created, and I would say to them, and I'll pay for the change. I don't care what it costs. I said, I don't care. Take all the money from all the proceeds. It doesn't matter to me. I need to make these changes. And now they plan, so it doesn't get to that stage. But that's the approach.
So that's super interesting, the sort of iterative, nested quality of this,
right.
which is, a word that comes up a lot in your work as well. So are you doing this I like getting in the nitty gritty here. Are you doing the work by hand or by longhand? Or are you doing it in a computer?
Yeah, I can't write with a pen or a pencil or anything. It just, I deeply resist it. So it's got to be a keyboard.
Resist it.
Yeah. No, I mean, there have been times like I'm on an airplane or something, you know, but I just can't do it. So it's totally at the keyboard.
I see.
That's the only way.
So one of the things that I noticed though, and I think people's brains are very different from one another's. Yours has a capacity, it seems, to hold lots of people and ideas and things inside it simultaneously. So I'm interested in your citation practices because you have many interlocutors in your work from many different realms of life and thinking. So can you just talk a little bit about maybe how you then bring those sources in, or how they show up, and just how does that happen?
Well, I've always wanted to have a process, and I remember.
Me too.
Do you know Nick Lemon over at?
I know his work. Yes, very well.
So Nick and I were on the #1 train, like, I don't know, 4 years ago. We just happened to be subway at the same time, and he was in the middle of writing his book that just came out around just a little bit before mine. I can't remember the title, but. And we were just talking, and somehow it came up that he had this system that made use of all these apps where he could grab a piece of work that he wanted to make reference to, put it in this thing, and it would like populate it, and then he could easily go back at the reference. And I was like, wow, how wonderful that sounds. So I tried to set up like that, and it doesn't work. for me. And so the only thing that works is I just read and whatever I can retain, whatever I can hold on to, I make use of it. And then there are many, many times where I'll say, but wait, I remember there was a passage and it's in the upper two sentences of the right-hand page of that book. And if I can just, and so that's the kind of way that I've searched for it. What's changed things dramatically in this book, frankly, not from the past, is now with Kindle, you can search easily. And so what used to be a highly almost geographic sleuthing of trying to find the place on the page in the book that had a cover which was blue and green, I can't remember the author, it was that sort of thing. Now it's become more systematic by virtue of the search feature, but I don't have a process. I don't, as I was mentioning, I don't have index cards. I don't have files, and I probably would be better off if I did.
You seem to be doing okay. So,
but it does take a lot of time to reconstruct. Whereas it strikes me that Nick is just like he actually said to me on the train, and I don't really have conversations about writing with many people. So maybe this is a kind of discourse that frequently occurs among you writers. But he said to me, I'm now done with the research and now it's easy. It's just the writing. And to hear that, it's like such a weird phrase, because to me, it's always just the writing. It's never just the writing, but to him, the process is you got to research, you get it all together, you organize it, you have it in your place. And now it's just a matter of turning it into prose. But to me, the turning into prose is from the get-go intertwined with all of it, because there isn't a research phase. It's all part of the same activity.
So if you were in charge of education in undergraduate or middle and high school education, where would writing sit in relationship to science education or education writ large? Like where would you have it happen?
Well, it's a big question. And what I mean by that is I don't think that you can answer a question like that without answering the question of how would you structure education, period, as opposed to how would you structure this component of education. And I know this discussion is not about education per se, but I would just say, broadly speaking, I feel really strongly that where we fail is in trying to have universal answers to questions like the one that you just asked that will work for every student, that we will apply across the board. And that's true in every subject. The problem with education as it currently stands is the ratio of students to faculty, students to teachers, is at a level that you have to have universal approaches. You don't have the capacity, say, as a high school teacher to teach 30 different ways to 30 different students in your class, but we should be doing that. And one day we will be doing that. One day when we have the assistance of powerful technological tools that are totally in their infancy today, we will be able to do that. And so the answer that I ultimately would give to a question like that is, it depends. It depends deeply on the student.
I can totally understand that. That makes sense. So maybe I want to ask something different, which is about the something that you said in an interview recently about how difficult it is. You said it's an art to try to intervene or to be the intermediary, rather, between a world in which the ideas articulated in equations, in mathematical symbols, and a world, the everyday world in which we communicate in ordinary English language. And I'm just wondering about at what moments, like you found your way to this. Someone called upon you at some level to say, write a book, do this translation work, which is a word you use frequently. How integral do you think it is for people who are learning science to be in a position where they're doing some of this articulation? So not education for everyone.
Yeah, sure.
No,
I totally get it. And a lot of it depends on the way in which a student engages with the scientific ideas. Let me be specific. So when I'm doing research, ultimately it's a highly mathematical process where one, in a field like theoretical physics, you are largely using equations and largely avoiding any observation or experiment. So that's the depth of the process. And for me, when I do that, I feel the need to have a parallel track that I, in my own mind, develop while working with the equations, in which I'm having pictures and images and a more human-like articulation of what the equations are doing. So that's my scientific process. And so when it came to writing, say, my first book and second and third book too, really, it was largely a matter of making use of a library of parallel descriptions that had already gone far toward developing, and using them to explain these ideas to a public that may not have a degree in mathematics. And so for me, the writing of these books is not that different from the process of being immersed in the scientific ideas. For others who don't have that particular process, writing a book or bringing these ideas out to the general public may be an enormous distraction that isn't the best use of their time. For some, stay in the laboratory, stay doing the equations. That's the best use of your time. For me, I always knew at some level that I wouldn't be spending 100% of my time just doing the research. Again, going back to the 11th grade experience, not too long ago, I came upon my college essay, and it was a weird experience to read it, because almost to the letter, I've followed what I wrote about in my college essay. And it's not because I had a plan. It's not because I was following. I didn't even remember what I wrote. And then as I'm reading, I'm like, oh my God, what's going on? I did exactly, doing research, bringing it to the public, but, so it was all there. So for me, it was always that I had some motivation, some drive to step outside the pure academic and engage with the public in a manner that would take what I consider to be the most wondrous ideas that we've ever developed as a species and allow a broader swath of the public to enjoy and experience and immerse themselves in those ideas. That was always there, but for some scientists, it's not, and that's fine.
That seems really crucial to think about. For how long are we telling ourselves a story of our proclivities and our priorities or our visions? That seems crucial. I want to just show now, just share a couple of quotations from recent things of yours, and also maybe to look at a couple of current projects that really open up the idea of where your work can go, so that you can tell us a little bit about where it came from, the work you're trying to do in the world with it. And then if we have time, we'll just have a little follow-up before we can turn to questions from the folks in the room with us. So I'll just share this so we can see. Okay, great. Okay, so here is recently from New York Times, a piece that you had written. And I'm wondering if you will talk a little bit about the nature of truth that you're talking about here, and also how it was that you decided, or that someone decided, that you should be helping us think about art. It makes sense because of your commitment to it, but I also wonder about where pieces like this come from. When do we get called on to do this work? So I wonder if you would actually just read this quotation, since it is you, in your own voice, so we can hear you.
Yes, I'm happy to. I just need to be able to see it. So good. There are truths that stand beyond articulation, whether in the language of mathematics or that of human discourse. There are truths we can sense, truths we can feel, that would be diminished by translation from inner expression. Art is our most refined means for accessing such truths. Whereas the patterns of math and science matter because they speak to qualities of reality that exist beyond us. The patterns of art matter because they speak to qualities of reality that exist within us. And so maybe I'll answer your second question first. Where did the opportunity to write the article from which this is an excerpt, where that come from? And I was just contacted by the New York Times that was doing a series on, I don't remember the exact name of the series, but it was different approaches, different perspectives on art. And so they came to me to, to get the scientist's perspective on art, which is, but it was open-ended. And they said, look, you can do whatever you want, within the word limit that they provided. And I in the piece itself am describing ideas that in more detail are actually in my latest book, Until the End of Time. I think it's chapter 8 or something like that. And we scientists like to think that we have some kind of monopoly on truth. We often speak in those terms, and I'm guilty of speaking in that way too. So I'm not saying that it's my colleagues that need to be educated. I use the language too, because when you are dealing with mathematical equations that can predict qualities of particles, like say the electron, and the math can predict qualities of the particle like its magnetic moment to 10 digits after the decimal point. And when the prediction agrees with observation, digit by digit by digit, 10 decimal places down the line, it does give you a sense of deeply connecting with reality, deeply revealing the truths that are out there. And of course, the problem with that perspective, not that in and of itself it's inaccurate, but the problem with that perspective is those are not the only truths. Those are not the only truths that matter. I've heard colleagues of mine, prominent colleagues of mine, saying things in public forums of the sort, science is the only pathway toward truth. And I sit there and it makes me deeply uncomfortable, because science is not the only pathway toward truth. There are inner truths. There are, if you might call them, subjective truths. There are things that matter to us as human beings that require turning the spotlight of exploration inward as opposed to outward. And that inward spotlight can reveal qualities of who we are, how we came to be, the things that matter to us. And those qualities can then be brought back out to the world in ways that capture them better than a mathematical equation can ever capture those qualities, and better than words can ever capture them. And of course, I'm referring to bring them out through music, or through art, or through poetry, or through choreography, or through movement of any sort. I mean, there are ways in which we can get our arms around qualities of subjective truth, subjective experience, that simply cannot be written down, cannot be articulated in natural language.
So we have to have multiple systems and multiple languages.
Absolutely. To me, math is just a language. There are times when I was younger, I viewed math as something that we discovered, that it was out there. This has been a debate that's been going on for millennia. How does math sit within the collection of ideas that we use to describe things in the world? Discovered or invented? I do think that it is invented. I think math is like a natural language, but it's one that evolved in order to capture in the most precise way certain patterns of experience, like in the second part of the quote that you had me read. And that is just one language. And there are many other languages if we allow ourselves to broaden the definition of that term. And the language is within which art is expressed are potent at articulating certain things that natural language, that mathematics is not adept at doing.
So I'm just showing 4 of the books, 4 of your books, before we get to your most recent one. And I just wonder if you would very briefly just walk us through, post The Elegant Universe, the problems that drove you to problem with it, like in a good way, right? or maybe the not so good way. What were the problems that drove the decision to write each of these books in the ways that you did?
Yeah, well, they do naturally follow upon each other. When I was writing The Elegant Universe, it felt as though there were these two characters. They kept trying to steal the spotlight, space and time. And I gave them part of their due in The Elegant Universe, but The Elegant Universe was about unification. It was about string theory. And so space and time ultimately had to be supporting players in that particular narrative. And so when I finished the book, it just felt important to me, and it kept coming back to main memory that maybe there's an opportunity here to give space and time really the headline, and that's what The Fabric of the Cosmos is. It's about the weirdnesses of space and time right through our understanding from early days to cutting edge research. And then the hidden reality emerged naturally from that, because when you're talking about space and time, you're talking about the arena of the universe. And for many people, the universe is the reality. And what the hidden reality was about is that there are actually the possibility of other realms beyond space and time as we know them. And chapter by chapter, I take the reader on an exploration of this larger possible landscape of reality, which is the multiverse, and that's what the hidden reality is all about. The final book there is completely different. Icarus at the Edge of Time is really a kid's book, although adults have written to me having enjoyed it. It's really a very short story, and I did not write it as a book initially. I wrote it because I wanted to create a stage work that would be performed sort of like Peter and the Wolf is performed, with an orchestra and a narrator and a film. And that was the impetus for the story. And the story very quickly is a rewriting of the classic Greek myth of Icarus, where in this version, rather than a boy putting on wax wings against his father's admonition and flying too close to the sun and dying, in this version, a boy, against his father's admonition, builds a spaceship and flies to the edge of a black hole. And from that point on, it's the general theory of relativity that takes over the narrative, not in any pedagogical way, but through the experience of the boy. Time slows down near the edge of a black hole. So when the boy finishes his joyride around the edge of a black hole and returns, he has aged far less than everybody else. In fact, everybody else has aged 10,000 years. This is real science. This is not science fiction in terms of how things would actually play out in a story if you could actually go to the edge of a black hole. And so in this version, the boy doesn't die as he does in the classic myth, but rather he has to acclimate to a new reality. And I felt the need to write that story for a long time, because the usual myth of Icarus always struck me as the story of ultimate social control. Don't do what dad says and you die. And that to me was exactly diametrically opposite to what you need to do in life, or certainly as a scientist. You need to go against authority or you'll never do anything new. You don't die for that transgression, but you may change the world in a way that forces you to completely acclimate to a different set of conditions. And that's what happens in the story. And so I showed this little libretto, if you will, very small number of words, to the publisher at Knopf, and they were like, "Let's turn it into a book." I was like, "Okay," and that's where the book came from.
That's wonderful. So, as you were writing this, as I mentioned before, for those who haven't encountered your work firsthand yet, one of the things that's really wonderful is to see how in conversation you are with other writers and thinkers from across disciplines and time. Are there writers of anything, but maybe particularly writers of science? I know Feynman shows up more than once in your work, whose like way of thinking about what it means to write science is influential or interesting to you. Do you find it compelling?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, certainly Steven Pinker, I think, has a wonderful capacity to structure an argument in a way that seductively brings you into a perspective about whatever he's writing about. And he has a a great capacity to leverage language in a very potent way. Richard Dawkins, while I don't always agree with what Richard says, I think Richard, again, is a scientist who has an enormous capacity for communicating difficult ideas in a way where you feel like you just get it. So those are sort of two examples there. But the other that comes to mind, just because you were mentioning Icarus at the edge of time, is David Henry Huang, right here at Columbia. Because when it came to trying to transform the book as I wrote it into a live show, which we ultimately did, David, I learned an enormous amount from David in terms of the kinds of writing that works on the page, the kinds of writing that can work on a stage. And they're different, and they're very different. And that to me was a wonderful experience, to kind of be shoulder to shoulder with someone of that magnitude talent in working with, material that I had initially set down, but figuring out how to refashion it into a form that would work in a performance setting.
So we only have time for a couple more minutes with us, so to let everyone else into the conversation, which I'm sure they're really wanting to ask some questions of their own. I'll just remind that our participants in the room, if you want to ask questions, go ahead and send them to Beth Samea Q&A to make sure that we can ask them ourselves in just a minute. And I'd like us to take a look maybe just at one of the clips that we have available to us, either from Light Falls or from Icarus. Do you have a preference of which one we might take a look at?
Oh, gosh. Well, since we've already said a lot about Icarus, maybe we do the other one.
That sounds great. So will you just set up what we're going to see and where that project came from, and how it came about, just really briefly?
Yeah, so basically to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Einstein's discovery of general relativity, which was November 25, 1915, we decided to create a stage piece that would really explore his process in going from a young brash student, to this pinnacle mind that rewrote the rules of reality, and on to the tragic end when he tries to use the same approach to make further breakthroughs and he fails. And so it's a really dramatic story. It also involves Einstein in competition with other scientists, which these sorts of things have not been given as much attention as one would have thought. You just hear Einstein and he's in a class by himself. But the fact of the matter is Einstein was engaged in some pretty heady competition, racing to the finish line to complete the general theory of relativity. So anyway, that's where it came from. So it's a stage piece where I played the role of narrator, and there are three actors. They don't try to look like the characters, but the words that they speak are all taken right from the historical record. So when you go to this piece, you're hearing from the scientists, and I basically am the glue that tries to bring it all together in a way that has some coherence.
Wonderful. So let's just see a little bit of this so that folks can get a sense of what it's like, and it's so immersive. And then we'll move on to questions from everyone.
Within this immersion in clocks and synchronization, Einstein continues to ruminate on light and its speed, and it proves a potent mix. There's no way Einstein could have known it, but the solution to his decade-long puzzle about why we don't see stationary light, the solution to that puzzle is now just weeks away.
I spent almost a year in vain trying to modify the ideas of Lorentz in the hopes of resolving the problem. By chance, a friend of mine in Bern, Michele Besso, helped me out. It was a beautiful day when I visited with this problem. I started the conversation in the following way. Recently, I've been working on a difficult problem. Today, I come here to battle against the problem with you. We discussed every aspect of the problem. Then suddenly, I understood where the key to the problem lay.
Einstein left, and as he described it, a storm broke out in his mind. Light, electricity, magnetism, waves, frequency, motion, velocity, clocks, contraction, trains, transformation, simultaneity, synchronicity, space, time.
The next day I came back to Besso and I said to him, without even saying hello, "Thank you. I have completely solved the problem."
Then let us move directly into our question and answer period. So folks, if you have questions, go ahead and let us know and we can start to take them. Dan Bamarito, will you ask your question, please?
Thanks so much for the great presentation and conversation. I had a question about, Professor Greene, how you conceptualize your audience. Who's the person you're envisioning while you're writing, and how has that conception of your audience changed over the years?
Yeah, it's a good question. When I wrote my first book, The Elegant Universe, I definitely was imagining that I was writing for the individual who had some interest in science, had heard about Einstein's dream of a unified theory, had heard that there was interesting things that were happening in that subject and wanted to know what it was all about. And that was the kind of image that I had in mind. Again, when writing the book, as I think I said in one of the prefaces to one of the editions, I had no idea if anyone was going to read a book of this sort. My mom certainly thought nobody would read it. She saw I was working hard on it, and I could tell that she was like, "Oh, this is really going to be so sad when it doesn't sell any copies." And so I was pleasantly surprised when there was a broader audience than the one that I had in mind. And certainly that then informed, the next book, Fabric of the Cosmos. I was thinking, well, that audience that enjoyed The Elegant Universe certainly broader than I anticipated. So I certainly had in mind an audience that maybe didn't have that initiation into science that I was imagining for The Elegant Universe. And if I then fast forward to my most recent book, that's quite different, because in this book, the goal was not to bring cutting edge scientific ideas to a general audience, which in rough language was the goal of the previous 3 books in one way or another. And it isn't that I wasn't bringing some cutting edge ideas to a general audience, but rather I really wanted this to be a book that could appeal to anyone who is really deeply curious about where we came from, why we do what we do, and where we're going. And I'd like to think that was quite broad. So for this book in particular, my older sister, she's a psychotherapist and interested in ideas, but doesn't have any formal training in the kind of science that I do. I had her in mind as the kind of representative reader, and she was reading chapters, which she never read chapters in anything that I wrote previously. And I don't think she's read anything I wrote previously. So that was a good exercise, and that was the rhythm for writing that most recent book.
Thanks very much for that. So we have a next question, please, from Leah Wardlaw. Leah, would you ask your question, please?
Yes, I would love to say that I really enjoyed this presentation. I'm a senior at Spelman College, and I am currently applying to the narrative medicine program, and I can't help but see the parallels between this presentation and the program here at Columbia. So information accessibility is something that is a really great area of passion for me. And so something that's very near and dear to my heart is the ways that science and issues of science affect marginalized communities. And I would love to know what your perspective is on how we can use literature, art, and the humanization of these fields to more effectively reach students that will then be the leaders within those fields, then affecting their communities. I think that it's just so important, especially since many of the children within these communities that I've worked with directly kind of feel like STEM and science is something outside of their realm of attainment. So I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I can give 2 answers, one that's perhaps directly relevant to the conversation that we're having here, and one that's more broad. So another hat that I wear is I'm a co-founder of a nonprofit organization called the World Science Festival, which has at its core the mission of bringing scientific programming, be it on a stage, be it, through conversations in theaters, be it through broadcast. The World Science Festival is the entity that produced the clip or the stage work that we were going to see a clip from that didn't quite work. And that organization has a deep outreach arm, and it's critical that we actively try to excite the next generation from diverse communities about the capacities of science to radically transform the world. And that is so vital because, studies have shown that kids who love science, they don't even know what science is, but they love exploration as young kids. By about the 4th grade, the 5th grade, they begin to turn away from it. So it's so important to get kids at a young age to recognize that the kinds of things of the drama of human discovery is what science is about, as opposed to what many of them come to learn from the classroom, that science is about memorizing the parts of the cell or solving that equation. Or my daughter right now is trying to learn the nomenclature in chemistry for when you bring elements together. Is it a metal with a non-metal and there's this convention? Is it a non-metal with that? And I sit there, I say, oh my God, that is so, there is such wonder to be found in the processes that happen at the microscopic level in our world. And we're burdening students with naming conventions. If you're going to be a chemist, know your naming conventions. But if you're a kid and you're just taking a chemistry course, holy crap, what are we doing? And it's that kind of process that slams out the interest in science, kids across the board. And that's what we at the World Science Festival try to change by virtue of telling the stories of science, as opposed to getting so focused on the details of science. In terms of writing and in terms of classes, I'm teaching a class right now that's based on my latest book. And whereas normally when I teach quantum mechanics, I get the physics majors and that's it. When I teach this course, there are 150 students. And when I look at the Zoom boxes, it's a huge range of students from a huge range of background. It's incredibly diverse. So I think courses of the sort that allow science to be interwoven with larger issues, philosophical issues, psychological issues, literary issues. I think if we can create more scientific opportunities of that sort, we have a chance of reaching a much broader audience.
Thank you for that. So we have another question about reaching a broader audience. This one from Kyle Barron. Kyle, would you ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dr. Greene, for this talk. It's been fantastic. This kind of ties in directly with Dan's original question and then Leah's question about kind of engaging with these audiences. I study the rhetoric of science, and specifically, I'm interested in the power of narratives to kind of draw people in and influence them. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of how to reach out to audiences who are resistant or even combative or actively opposed to scientific thought and data, especially when there's a really urgent kind of world endangering need, kind of like climate change, and what you think we as researchers and writers and authors can kind of do fast.
Yeah, well, what I would say is it's an important question. And at first sight, you would think that an important part of the answer, or maybe the dominant part of the answer, should be, okay, here's our strategy. We just need to get these ideas out there in this and that way. And we have a chance of capturing the minds of individuals who otherwise would be hostile to science. And the problem with that perspective is, the fact of the matter is, many who are hostile to science are not hostile to the content of science. They're hostile to the sociology of science. They're hostile to the fact that science has experts and they identify with a group in the world that says all expertise is garbage, all expertise is a waste of time. And so it's far more an issue of identity politics than it is in terms of doing a better job of getting the content of science out there, unfortunately. The fact of the matter is, the kinds of individuals that you're referring to, I don't think they're sitting there saying to themselves, you know, quantum mechanics, you know, the way it describes the double slit experiment, no, I just don't think it's the right thing. That's not what's happening. It's not a careful analysis of the content. Rather, it is who's in my group and what are they saying? That's what they're saying. So I'm with them, and therefore I buy into that perspective. So that's answer number one. Answer number two, you can't give up, even if that is the situation. And so I can just tell you concretely, we have this, I mentioned this World Science Festival. It's in New York, it's in Brisbane, Australia. But now we're in conversation of trying to bring these public celebrations of science to Middle America, to parts of the country where science is not celebrated, to say the least. And the hope would be that by just having science in the community in a way that brings out, say, enough celebrity talent, for instance, that it will draw enough of an audience that it can begin to shift the perspective on what science is about. So that's one small way of doing it. But look, we've had shows on PBS. Who watches them? The people who are already interested and committed to a scientific perspective. I write a book. On occasion, it will reach someone unexpected. And I'm thrilled when I get emails. I got an email a few years ago from a trucker down in Texas who said that he somehow stumbled upon The Elegant Universe and was reading it. And because of that, he wasn't going to the gatherings at the bar with the other truckers, and they were getting mad at him. And he was like recounting this to me. I was like, yeah, you go. That's fantastic. But that's rare. I think it's very hard to break out with good science content because nobody who isn't already predisposed to science is going to engage with it.
Thank you. Talking about people who may or may not engage with science and people who may or may not engage with art, I'd like to call on Alessia Palanti to ask your question, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for this talk. I guess I really appreciate you saying that you find there to be truths, plural, rather than declaring science as like a single avenue to truth with a capital T. And as an artist, I appreciate your acknowledgement of the arts as partaking in meaning making and truth finding. So I was wondering, what do you think scientists already do, can do, or should do to help bridge two approaches that are so frequently considered polar opposites?
Well, I think part of it is to be receptive to artists who are themselves interested in gaining inspiration from scientific insights. I was very surprised that shortly after The Elegant Universe came out, which is a long time ago now, it was 1999 or something, the number of artists that wrote to me who were just hungry to know more. And I was certainly receptive, and I've been receptive. I worked with a couple choreographers. At first, when they contacted me, I was like, are you kidding me? Choreography on The Elegant Universe? What are you talking about? It was but I was like, okay, let's check it out. And they, one woman was at Columbia, Sandra Kaufman, and another choreographer who did a wonderful piece called Three Theories, Quantum Mechanics, Relativity and String Theory, that was at the Guggenheim Museum. And so these opportunities to cross-pollinate are there. And I think many scientists are open to it. Jan Levin here at Columbia at Pioneer Works, which is a wonderful, obviously with everything that's going on now, you can't go visit it, but when the world is back to normal, has wonderful events that bring art and science together in a beautiful space in Brooklyn. So I think it's really a matter of being open and allowing for the cross-pollination to happen.
Thank you.
And on that note of collaboration, this is the end of our time that we have together. And so if in a normal space, we would be able to applaud you with rapturous applause. So if you want to take off your mute and give some regular human applause, we can do that.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Professor Greene, for being this guest, and we'll look forward to being in touch and enjoying more of your work in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.